Every parent wants to give their child the best shot at achieving their football dreams. But with so many options and so many costs, it can feel overwhelming. Maybe the best opportunities don't require you to break the bank. Maybe it does. Today I'm breaking down the right football path for your child. No fluff, just what works. In this video, we're going to focus on 3 main paths. Number 1 is overseas trials. Are they worth it or just a money pit? Number 2, local leagues like NPL. Are they really a solid option? And number 3, academies. The pros, the cons, and how to separate the real ones from the fake ones. But I'm also going to get real about the elephant in the room, money. If you're not in a position to spend big, this video may be a guide to still help your child have a real chance of success. No false promises, no gimmicks. So hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have the most realistic option for your situation. But before I get started, why should you listen to me? Well, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Alan Derrett. I'm a full-time football agent and the co-founder of Australia's largest player agency, Elite Football. I've helped a handful of players transition from amateur to pro, hundreds of players for representation, and we work with over 25 professional clubs across Europe, South America, and the UAE. Okay, touching on number 1, overseas trials. Now look, I want to start this video by going and explain that I really wanted to make something to actually help parents have a bit of guidance with a lot of questions I always get asked. These are probably the 3 main pathways, I guess, that you can use in terms of the football space in Australia. And if you're watching this, it's probably the same in USA and Canada because they have similar systems to what we have available to us here. Now, first point, overseas trials. This, in my opinion, is the best way to get a player from amateur to pro. You cannot compare the amount of leagues, professional leagues that we have here in Australia, spoiler alert, it's only 1, to how many there is in Europe and how close it all is together. The game is just 10,000 times bigger, right? There's just so much more money over there. And I do think that Aussie players are probably better off to go over there. Again, take this with a grain of salt because I am a biased opinion of this because this is what I do for a living, right? I help transition amateurs to pro. But what I want to say in this point, because the reality is that most of you watching this are not gonna come to my agency or use my services. So I want you guys to be the most informed that you can be in case you don't go through us. Overseas trials can be relatively affordable. Yes, they are still expensive, but it can be done the right way. What I would preface is that they can also be extremely expensive. And there is a lot of scams in this industry. There is a lot of shady stuff that goes on. There's a lot of people that value stack their marketing of what they sell you to just upsell you something crazy for nothing, really. To explain this point further, I know someone that I had actually a client come to me and they were telling me that they're upset because they came from this other person, and basically, without, throwing anyone under the bus, just because my team wouldn't be very happy if I did that, although one day I will make it name and shame and expose. Basically, this guy, what he does is he sells like a test. Basically, you do like this thing and he pulls some hair out and he gets your genetic test or whatever, yada, yada, yada. And it's basically like a coaching course or like a training course or whatever. Anyways, the plan costs around $50,000, right? And then on top of that, you have to pay an extra X amount of money, like $30,000 or whatever, to go overseas. And people spend huge amounts of money for nothing, really, because they're just, unfortunately, just get taken advantage of, and parents want to do the best for their child. And I totally get it. I was scammed, not by this guy, by someone else. Back when I was trying to become a footballer, right? I was sent overseas and I was just in some random academy. Had no one fighting for me, no one doing anything, and that was it, right? So, my money, my parents' money, so I know firsthand what it feels like. So I want to preface that be really careful because it's one of those weird things that parents will do almost anything for their kids, and that's very honorable, right? But you also have money pits that get synced up, right? Like, for example, for that type of money, like I could send a player overseas for like 2 full years and trial at like a host of different clubs, you know what I mean? And really get exposure. And so there's ways and ways of actually doing it properly. And a lot of the times I'll see tours and experiences that will charge you an arm and a leg for 2 weeks. Nothing's ever going to happen in 2 weeks. No one's going to make a decision on your child to sign an amateur player in 2 weeks. Doesn't matter if he puts on a messy performance, it's just not going to happen. And they charge an arm and a leg for those 2 weeks, right? Usually for the same amount of time, you know, like with the money you spend, you could go for 3 months and trial at a few different clubs, right? It's a big difference is what I'm trying to say. And that would be the biggest thing that I'd say with that point is overseas trials is my favorite thing. I am very cynical on the Australian system right now. I don't actually think that it's ever going to go anywhere. There's a huge host of speculation on second divisions and this and that and whatever, but honestly, until it's there, I am a non-believer. And again, could be biased, but I do think it is the best thing. If you can afford it, sending a player once a year, every year for a few years, trialing at different clubs is going to be the only and the best exposure that they could possibly get. Now, what if you can't afford it? Well, that brings me on to my next point, which would be NPL, right? NPL, still expensive, right? Most people are charging anywhere from $2,500 to, I know some teams are charging like $6,000 to $7,000 for the season, right? Like that's the sort of middle ground. The middle ground would probably be about $4,000. Around there is where most clubs are sort of charging. It's still a lot of money, right? Not everyone has $4,000 to spend on NPL, and a lot of people spending that and then also doing coaching on the side and also doing this and whatever, and everything really adds up. My opinion on NPL is I don't see it as that necessary, and I'll get to it. Basically, I've signed players like amateurs. I've done their first transition from amateur to actually signing with a youth team in Spain to like a first division, second division youth team that weren't even playing NPL, right? They were actually lower than that. So you can have talent, you can have whatever, but if you don't have the connections, if you don't have the right team work with you, nothing's going to happen at the end of the day anyways. So NPL may not be that focal point for you. I actually think there's a lot of value in getting the right development over it. And sometimes a lot of, you know, at the end of the day, these NPL teams, they have teams of like 20 kids, but they can only take 15 on a weekend and only, you know, 12 or 13 get game time. And if you're one of those poor 5 or 6 suckers that paid the money and you're just sitting on the bench, well, that doesn't really do you any good, right? And so sometimes it's better to play in a lower division and get that game time as opposed to just being in the better team and not getting any game time, right? Like you're in your formative years from under 9s to 16, 17, so need to prioritize game time. But I guess it is the lesser of two evils if you can't afford to go overseas. If you can't afford to go overseas, NPL probably is your best bet if you can afford that sort of 4,000 range, assuming that your son or daughter gets game time. That's the only caveat that I'll put on the NPL system. If they don't, then move them down to the local leagues, because I don't think the benefit of playing NPL is that you get better coaches, better this, better whatever. It's really all relative, right? Maybe you play at a better level, but really it's kind of close in terms of NPL and Div 1 or whatever you call it, right? In whatever state. It's pretty close. And the other thing I would prefer for you to focus on for your child if they can't go overseas is connections. Connections are the main thing, right? If you don't think they can ever go elsewhere overseas and you're stuck in the bubble of Australia, well, you need to focus on the coaching, the staff, the whatever management, right? And get as many connections as possible, because that's the only actual way you're going to go up. Unless you're extremely talented and, you know, you're just sort of one of those few NPL players that you probably see in those senior teams. They always transfer every season. They, you know, make some good money in what is our second division. The way you can survive after those youth years is by having those contacts of a bunch of different coaches that are still coaching. You know, someone that coached you when you were under 15s is going to now be a coach of, you know, some other team that's under 18s now or whatever, right? And then in a few years, that same guy might be in a first division, you know, in a sort of senior team NPL or whatever, right? And that's just how the football world works, even in Australia. Like, they're going to call players that they are aware of, right? Some people want to make the state teams, but the state coach coaches this NPL team as well, and he's going to pull 5 or 6 players from his own team. And that's just how it is. That's just how football is. That's how the world is, right? So as opposed to focusing on just NPL, I'd focus on working with those best coaches, the coaches that you see that that want to keep being in the game, because that's probably going to be actually better for you than just hopping around, right? And I don't see, like, as say you can't afford NPL, I don't think it's bad going into Div 1 local leagues or whatever because of that reason, because you can still find really good coaches that want to progress and get into NPLs and get into this and get into whatever and subsidize maybe whatever and help you in the future. I know it sounds kind of like a Hail Mary, it sounds like it, but it just kind of is. You don't really see the work you do in the early years. It just sort of comes later. Everything just sort of, it's like a snowball effect, right? Now, moving on to point 3, right? Say can't afford overseas trials, or maybe you just don't want to send your kid over there because they're too young, whatever, you know, it may be. NPL is also too expensive, perhaps, or maybe it's not even an option for you. Maybe you live in some rural area and there's no NPL team nearby, which definitely is a possibility, right? Well, you're probably stuck with this third option, right? And the third option is academies. Now, academies is such an oversaturated market right now. There just seems to be thousands of academies, right? It almost feels like personal trainers. Like I feel like you know, there's thousands of gyms and there's just hundreds of thousands of personal trainers, right? And it feels like there's just thousands of academies. Every time I travel from state to state, I always just get flooded with ads from all these different academies, because obviously that's sort of the stuff I click on, but there's heaps of them. Now, how do you filter from the good and the bad? It will be really hard to do. I would say that priority, if you're looking at academies, right? Say you don't want to do NPL, you want to do local leagues and save on the tuition fees, registration fees, go local league, may only be like $700 or whatever it is, and you still want to use that money to help or whatever, you could probably use a few $1,000s on an academy and get those extra training sessions that you would normally get with an NPL team, right? And it may be a bit more personalized, a bit more one-on-one, whatever it is. Or maybe you actually could get a personal trainer and some academy stuff or whatever and use that money elsewhere, right, for your kid, which I think is totally cool. Whatever you can do is going to help, right? Regardless. How do you sort through the good and the bad? First, I'd focus on the ones that are, one, not trying to sell you an overseas experience, not trying to sell you a tour, not trying to sell you trials, not trying to sell you anything besides coaching, whether it's one-on-one, whether it's, you know, 1-on-5, whether it's a group session, whatever it is. That is really the golden rule, in my opinion, from sourcing through the pile of poo-poo that is the academy section. Working with people that only have a love for coaching is going to be way better than people that, you know, are doing it because they want a side gig, because they want a side income, because they really like football and they want to make money out of it in the future, or whatever it is. If you want an experience or a tour, if that's something you're interested in, something you want to spend money on, go find someone that just does that, because they're going to provide a better thing at that. If you want an agent, you know, for trials, go find an agent that just does that. If you want a really good coach, go find a coach that only does coaching. It seems like such a simple thing that I think goes over the top of a lot of people's heads, but the people that are really good at what they do are only doing the one thing. They're very niche down, they're very concentrated, and they're only doing the one thing. And that's how they become really good at that thing. And everyone that does all these few little things, like, they just die in a few years. Like, academies come up and they go, they come up and they go, because they're trying to do too much. They have no identity, they don't really know what they're doing, right? And the service sucks. And so that's my like golden rule of thumb, is make sure you're in a place, or you're in an academy where the coach just wants to coach, wants to build the best academy, or maybe has aspirations to turn it into a club or whatever, you know? But coaching needs to be the one and only thing that they want to do. And that's where you're gonna get the best thing out of it, right? Now, what if you're watching this video and you go, I still don't have money for academies, or even the local leagues, or whatever it is? Look, tough. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the really good opportunities, even like my services and things like that I do deem are like really good, it costs money, you know, and it's annoying, but it just does. And we're living in an industry where that's just how it's moving into. But if I, you know, 13 to 17 and playing football or whatever, there wasn't much to go around. I probably couldn't afford to go overseas, and, you know, we did everything that we could. And I also really struggled to pay for my NPL fees. Like, I didn't ask my mum to pay for my my sport program, my football sport program in high school, which was like $450 or something at the time, because I knew she didn't have it. And so I know that things can be tough sometimes, right? And so what would I actually do if I was one of those families? Because obviously 1, 2, and 3, it all costs money, right? Well, I think there's only a few things you can do. Make the most of what you have, right? So local opportunities, like I said, local leagues or whatever, a lot of them do subsidize payments. They do allow for almost like scholarship. If you ask, like you already have a no, but if you ask, send those emails, whatever, a lot of them will actually give it to you for free as long as you do like some volunteer work or things like that. Some clubs are really good like that. I would also say self-promotion. It doesn't really cost much to make video highlights. If your boy has the talent or your girl has the talent and you make highlight videos, you promote, you try and find value somehow where they get picked up, they get views, they get whatever, you will slowly start getting traction and realize that there'll be clubs that start calling you and they'll be willing to pay for your tuition fees, right? So that's probably an angle where, with a lot of work, right, going down that road is another way where potentially you might be able to achieve that, right? And by creating demand where potentially there isn't any at the moment, where you can showcase and go, hey, these clubs are interested, but we're reaching out because we really want to, play somewhere closer to home or whatever. You send an email out like that, it's going to pique a club's interest and go, yeah, come for trials, and they might pay for your fees. Just an idea. There's probably online training courses, things that you can buy, like an app subscription or something, and give you a bunch of drills, and you could really take it that side where he's just training, or they're training in the backyard or in a park or whatever, and you do the one-on-one sessions. That could be an option. The network one that I mentioned before, I think is really important. Locally with local coaches, trying to build that connection, build those relationships, I think are really important. And then scholarships, like if you have the talent, I would knock on doors and be like, hey, this is, pay for the XYZ. And I think if you do have the talent, you would be surprised just by asking how many actual smaller clubs give you more than you'd think they would, because you're creating that sort of bubble for them. But really the only extra 2 options besides those sort of 3 main points that I brought up for people that, don't have the finances is the local and scholarship based opportunities, right? The rest of the other things I just mentioned, it's like a 0.01% chance of actually working out. But it's all stuff that you can do as an alternative just to help, right? But ultimately, nothing probably does beat the exposure of going overseas. To summarize, overseas trials are number 1. NPL system probably is a failing system and doesn't really work past the junior levels. And if you go the academy route, just be prepared to sort out 95% of really, really bad programs until you find a few that don't stink of poo-poo. If you enjoyed this video and learned anything new, even if it's just one piece of information, consider sending it to another parent that may find it useful, or subscribing. You can always decide to unsubscribe.